Hello and welcome to this video, and this video is going to be called Rainbow Rising versus 2112, or it might be called 2112 versus Rainbow Rising. Haven't decided which order to put them in yet. Which one do we go first with? And that's the big decision, isn't it? Because these are two seminal rock albums. And the reason I've pitted them against each other, they both come out of 1976. And 1976 is a strange time for progressive rock music and rock music. It's just before punk. It's just before that change where a lot of these bands that have been so successful in the early 70s, sort of legendary bands, are now going to be seen by the critics, at least, as dinosaur bands. You know, they're going to go out of fashion. And yet here we have two landmark rock albums, and I think the reason why they're both important, because in their own way they marry up progressive rock with heavy rock, hard rock, or even, as we called it in the old days back then, heavy metal. And that mixture of heavy rock, hard rock and prog is going to open the doors for so many different types of musics in the future. First off, new age of British heavy metal, and then following on from that, we're going to get the sort of neoclassical rock, we're going to get thrash metal, technical metal. All of those things are rooted in the marriage between a sort of symphonic classical approach to rock music marrying with a heavy metal approach. Now, Rush and Rainbow do that on both of these albums in the same year. So we can see 1976 as a watershed year for what could be called progressive metal, prog metal. Bands like Dream Theater. Right, so I thought it'd be really interesting to explore those two albums, and I'm going to try and come to a conclusion by the end of this video of which one is my favourite out of those albums, which one I think is the most important one. If I had to just own just one of them, or had to put just one into the room of magnificence, now which one would it be? And that's a difficult decision. I haven't made a decision now. I'm going to make that decision as I talk about it. So where shall we start with? I'm going to start off with Rainbow Rising, and the reason is because Ritchie Blackmore, who is the mastermind behind that album, has been around for longer than the guys from Rush. Ritchie Blackmore's history as a guitar player goes right back to the early 60s, where he was playing with the 60s band The Outlaws. He was also working with Joe Meek. Ritchie Blackmore is a guitarist that is there from the inception of rock music. He's a contemporary of Clapton. He's a contemporary of Jeff Beck, of Jimi Hendrix. Ritchie Blackmore was born in 1945, and same year as Eric Clapton. And by the mid-60s, he's on the scene in London. He established himself almost on a session scene, and he teams up with a number of different players. And I think the important one here is John Lord. And John Lord and him put together this idea of Deep Purple, and right from its inception, Deep Purple have progressive rock conceptual underpinnings. You know, they both bring that in. They're both in their own way interested in bringing a classical approach into rock music. This is really evidenced on the 1969 Music for Orchestra, which John Lord wrote, where he put an orchestra with Deep Purple. And I think this is a very, very important album in terms of the history of progressive rock. Ritchie Blackmore's got an interest, and it's in embryo at this time, but he's got an interest in bringing in classical influences, but more sort of Paganini neoclassical approach. Of course, back then it didn't have that name, but Blackmore is exploring those areas right from day one. But Blackmore's also got a very heavy rock approach, really coming out of Hendrix. He's taken on what Hendrix has done, taken on what guys like Jeff Beck have done, and he pulls that into the album Deep Purple in a Rock, which is really Deep Purple's first masterpiece. And Deep Purple then established themselves as one of the seminal heavy rock bands of the early 70s, selling millions and millions, right? As Deep Purple progresses, The sort of classical pretensions of John Lord get cast aside, and eventually the heavy rock approach of Richie Blackmore gets taken aside as the band goes to a more muso-y, jazzy, funky approach. Once Glenn Hughes and David Coverdale come in and replace Roger Glover and Ian Gillan on the Stormbringer album, you can see Richie's lost interest. And while he's still in the tenure of Deep Purple, around about the Stormbringer era, he decides to try something else. We don't see any of his compositions on Stormbringer, but you can really see Richie Blackmore stepping away from Deep Purple at this point. He's been on tour with Deep Purple, and opening up for them has been a band called Elf. And Elf have a singer called Ronnie James Dio. And I think Richie Blackmore and Ronnie James Dio bond over this idea of pulling in this sort of bombastic, symphonic, classical approach with hard rock. And they decide to make an album together, and they make an album that's actually called Rainbow, Richie Blackmore's Rainbow. And you can see Richie's really bowled over by this approach. This is the way he wants to go. He's not happy with the band. The rest of the band on that first album are basically Elf. He basically pulled an album, made an album with those guys. So he gets rid of those, and he basically reforms Rainbow, still with Ronnie James Dio on vocals, but with Jimmy Bain on bass, with Tony Carey on keyboards, and the incredible Cozy Powell, who before this was playing for Jeff Beck, on drums. This is an absolute incredible lineup. And they go into the studio, and in 1976 they record an album called Rainbow Rising. And Rainbow Rising for me is an utter masterpiece, where some of the ideas that he was exploring on Richie Blackmore's Rainbow, they just consolidate. It's heavier, and it's also more orchestral. And I think also just having those sort of cannon-like drums of Cozy Powell and the incredible vocal of Ronnie James Dio, which combines a sort of operatic approach with a throaty sort of Paul Rodgers free approach. Those two things together, I mean, Ronnie James Dio is really one of the great rock singers of all time. It's an absolutely incredible album. It's beautifully recorded. And on side 2, they really amp up the sort of progressive rockness. But this isn't straight down the line progressive rock, because it's so riffy and heavy. Stargazer on side 2 also features the Munich Philharmonic Orchestra. And that sort of orchestral expanded approach is so rooted in progressive rock. But for me, there's a new sound there. And the only way to describe this new sound is neoclassical. Richie Blackmore's really exploring the harmonic minor on this. He moves away from the blues and the blues scale as the underpinning of rock. And that sort of harmonic minor approach to composition gives the album a certain sound, right? So it's not progressive in that the tracks are 20 minutes long and there's all these different parts and they go through all this big journey. It's prog in that it's a pure marriage of heavy rock, the bombast of heavy rock and the bombast of classical music. And I think this is groundbreaking. I really do. He then follows the same sound on Long Live Rock and Roll, but and there's some incredible stuff on there. But as Rainbow progresses through the 70s, you can see he's taking that sound and pulling it down. And I think Ronnie James Dio, seeing that sort of commercial edge creeping in, he leaves to join Black Sabbath in, I think, 78, 79. Blackmore then pulls in the incredible Graham Bonnet, another one of rock's great singers, and Graham Bonnet contributes to one album, Down to Earth, which includes the Russ Ballard penned song Since You've Been Gone, which becomes a huge crossover hit. And from then on, Rainbow were chasing the charts, and chasing the charts brilliantly. I absolutely love those albums because the Rainbow sound is still there. I first came across Rainbow with the Down to Earth album. In fact, I've got a secret to tell you, is that the record that first fired me up when I was 12 years old in February 1980 was All Night Long, off the same album by Rainbow. When I heard that, there was a sound on there which was the sound of heavy rock, and little did I know, was also encased in that was this little tiny seeds of that bombastic prog rock metal sound. It's all embedded, even though that's a really tight little pop song with, I must say, pretty dubious lyrics, you know. And I've heard that single, and then I actually went out and bought the Monsters of Rock album, which contained the Graham Bonnet version of Stargazer. That was the album for me. Then I ran out and got the next album, which featured Joan Lynn Turner on vocals, which was Difficult to Cure, with another Russ Ballard penned hit, I Surrender. So we can see by the 80s, Rainbow have taken that sound, consolidated, and they're having huge hit records. You know, they have become basically a mainstream rock band. And I think Straight Between the Eyes, I love that album. It's hard for me to criticise these albums, but you can see them going more towards that sound. And by Bent Out of Shape, they'd lost me. Too much of an AOR, middle of the road rock band. But going back to Rainbow Rising, what we have here is, for me, part of the basis of prog metal, neoclassical metal, new wave of British heavy metal, and to some extent thrash metal. A very, very important album for rock music. But 1976 also sees the release of 2112 by Rush. Now, Rush were formed in 1970, so they're coming out a little bit later than the sort of classic Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin bands. And they're very, very influenced by those bands. I think you can see there's a lot of Cream in early Rush. There's a lot of Zeppelin in early Rush. Now, I'm going to be quite mean. You've got to understand, I love Rush. They're one of my favourite bands. I loved them right from when I was a very young musician. And I think they are so important in the development of technical skill in young musicians. Most musicians come to music through heavy metal, heavy rock. They start to listen to all the bands. And there is nothing like the astonishment you hear at 13, that you have at 13 years old when you hear Rush for the first time. Oh my God, can a rock band really play like this? But going back to in the early days, before Neil Peart has joined the band, we have a very young Geddy Lee and a very young Alex Lifeson, who record in 1973 their debut album Rush. And if you stand back and look at that objectively, what can I say? We've got a band which is completely enamoured by Led Zeppelin to the point where it is a pastiche, fronted by a singer that sounds like Donald Duck on helium. This is not the recipe for success, right? On a small label. So what we have is a local Canadian band aping Rush. That is really what we've got. Now, I can hear all the Rush fans getting really angry because that first album is so much better than that. Why is it better? Because of the songwriting. The songwriting, you know, tracks like Working Man are so strong, and that has always been the strength of Rush for me, their ability to write songs. So park that, So after the first album, John Rutsey leaves, and one of the great things for heavy rock happens is Neil Peart joins the band. Neil Peart he has got a signature drum sound and style that's going to become iconic. He's also a very intellectual person, and he is a lyricist as well as a drummer, and he brings in a conceptual, very proggy approach to rock music. Now, for me, the following album from 1974, I think, which is Fly By Night, they make the innovation there. On Fly By Night, for me, it's fully formed. There is what we can now call progressive metal. all right? Sometimes their extension of the form, in other words, the way they make long form compositions, is a bit clunky. It's a bit reliant on long form jams, you know, and even more so on the follow up to that, Caress of Steel, which has their first sidelong epic that for me is an utter failure and is just basically lots of little short tracks, you know, crammed together. You know, it sounds like a band that has probably listened to Yes and Jethro Tull, smoked a few too many joints, and he's been let loose in the studio. And they're trying to do something, but of course the record company looks, and what we see is something that's lacking a lot of commercial potential. This, you know, Led Zeppelin copy band with the helium Donald Duck singer has now gone down the road of, you know, sitting there making half-an-hour epics about Sword and the Sorcery and the Necromancer and Baitor and the Snow Dog and all that sort of stuff. People don't get it. Now the thing is, they are then giving their marching orders by the label. Write an album that people like, or sling your hook. And what do? And it's one of the great bold moves of rock music, is they just go for it 100%, and they decide to make another album with one conceptual huge track on side one and a bunch of Rush songs, you know, the standard stuff they've done before. Now, the reason why 2112 is so important is because people bought it. It was a success, right? But for me, they've actually pioneered this before, and they've done it successfully on Fly By Night. They've tried to push it out in Caress of Steel. It's, for, you know, the opening of the Necromancer for me is absolutely phenomenal. You know, there's some incredible stuff on Caress of Steel. I have never been one of these guys who doesn't like Caress of Steel. But on 2112, for some reason, they nail it. And again, I think it's down to the songwriting. Rush have always run through by being able to write very, very good songs. And I think on the opening of 2112, they have basically written their best song up until that point, which is Temples of the Syrinx or Syrinx, or however you pronounce it. The overture is basically like the blueprint of progressive metal. You know, it's basically the overture to 2112 encapsulates everything that Dream Theater are going to do. You take that, stick a bit of Iron Maiden in, and you have Dream Theater, and every progressive metal band that's going to come in after that, they lay the groundworks on that. And anybody who watched the Taylor Hawkins, you know, tribute concert last year, it was incredible to see, you know, Alex Lifeson and Geddy Lee come out and play Overture in front of that huge audience, because for me there was a statement. This is so important. As I'm saying this, it is selling 2112 for me. As I say, I think in that overture, we never really see that on Fly By Night or Caress of Steel, do we? And then they go into Temples of the Syrinx, which is just so full. It's just so full of heaviness, and it's so full of sort of sci-fi fantasy imagery. It's just progressive metal. For me, after that track falls flat. Is that sacrilege to say it? We get a lot of fannying about with a lot of acoustic guitar songs and trying to tell a story about something in a cave and all this. And then when we get to the end and it kicks all back in, that's exciting again. But for me, as a prog epic, someone who's grown up with like Close to the Edge and Awaken and Tarkus, you know, for me, it's a bit like clunky, right? But what redeems it is that incredible opening and that incredible ending. On side 2, we have a bunch of Rush songs. For me, it's not their best songs, it's not their worst songs. I think Passage to Bangkok is probably the classic one, but that does not. It's not one of the great Rush songs. I would argue that a tune like Anthem off the earlier album, that's off Fly By Night. I'm trying to going on my memory. Is far stronger than anything that's on side 2 of 2112. I was always a little bit let down by those. I mean, there's some cool stuff there. It's not terrible. It's really, really good, but it's not up there with a Cygnus X1 or, you know, Spirit the Radio or a Free Will or a Tom Sawyer or even Subdivisions. There's some good stuff there, but is this the making of classic rock? You know, is this masterpiece stuff? I'm not so sure. Rush then carry on, and they really explore deeper on the next album. They push the prog as far out as they can. You know, Farewell to Kings is their most prog album, but you can see them questioning the genre. Hemisphere's full on prog, right? But then they do the same thing, and by 79-80, the same as Rainbow, they are writing hit records, and we have Spirit of the Radio and Tom Sawyer, which have become FM AOR favourites. So there's the same trajectory there for Rush. It's really interesting. These aren't two bands that you could compare, you would think to compare in this way, but when you do, it's very interesting. Here we have between these two bands the beginnings of progressive metal, new age of British heavy metal, and the continual influence of progressive rock in heavy metal, which goes on to this day. So which album do I think is the best? I think in terms of influence on the genre, I think the Rush album just edges over Rainbow Rising. But in terms of a work of art, of a masterpiece, I think it's Rainbow Rising. On that album, every single song is an utter brilliant, the best example of this genre. Tarot Room, Starstruck, all these tracks are absolutely incredible. Incredible songwriting, incredible execution, incredible production. So I am going, in the end, against what I normally do, and just because you know how much I value innovation and influence as an indicator of artistic brilliance, but I think in pure musical terms, the Rainbow album is the album, and of course there's a huge influence there. There's no Yngwie Malmsteen, for example, without this, okay? And you can see as these bands carry on that Ritchie Blackmore's actual guitar solo style is going to be so influential on people like Uli John Roth and Yngwie Malmsteen, you know, Steve Vai to some extent, that sound in itself. Whereas with Rush, it's much more about Neil Peart's drums. That's the sound instrumentally that's going to go forward. It is really close one to call, but I think I'm going to go with Rainbow Rising. They're the ones that win for me today. Anyway, that's the end of the video. If you enjoyed this little comparison between these two albums, I've never done this format before. I thought it'd be quite interesting to explore two related albums together. We will have our Rainbow fans and we'll have our Rush fans, and we may have a few people who like both. So what's your opinion about this? You know, what do you think? So put it in the comments below. If you like this video, like it. If you want to see some more like this, subscribe and ring the notification bell. And if you want to really hear me go deep and really into the back end of progressive rock, jazz fusion, classic rock, jazz, then become a Patreon now. Go over there now. I've just done a 3-video series on rare John McLaughlin albums, you know. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, then come across and join me on Patreon. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next video.